As the ghost collector, when I meet someone new, if the opportunity presents itself, I'll eventually ask whether they've had a paranormal experience. Recently, within the span of about a week, I met two people who had both moved into beautiful old homes, the kind of houses everyone in town knows because of their history, their size, or the people who once lived there. The first woman actually lived in a house I already knew pretty well. Before she bought it, the place had sat empty for something like 12 years. And during that time, I had 3 opportunities to go inside. It was a big, creepy old house, filled with antique built-ins and original fixtures dating back nearly 100 years. I took photos, made some recordings, and even spent a little time asking whether anyone, or anything, was there and wanted to communicate. And I got absolutely nothing. Well, almost nothing. There was a strange pair of handprints on a basement window that I never could explain. So when I met the new owner, naturally I asked her if anything unusual had happened since she moved in, and her answer surprised me. No. As far as she was concerned, the house wasn't haunted at all. And really, that matched my own experience there. Then, not long afterward, I met someone from a nearby town who had recently moved into another prominent old house, a large colonial that had been standing for generations. And of course, I asked him the same question. This time, the answer was very different. His name is Larry, and this is his story. My family was getting ready to move into a house we had just purchased. It was a large colonial-style home, the kind of home I'd always dreamed about living in my whole life, and never thought I would. It needed a lot of work. For about 10 days after we got the keys, we worked on getting the place ready before moving in. We pulled down old drapes, tore out dirty carpet, stripped wallpaper, and put fresh paint on some of the rooms. It was much easier to do all that while the house was still empty. During that time, I spent a lot of hours there alone, sometimes working late into the night. But the first strange thing happened on the very first day. I had just gotten the keys, and I was excited. If you've ever bought a house, you probably know the feeling. The first time you unlock the door and walk inside knowing the place is finally yours. My wife and kids were at work and school, so I went over by myself with a load of clothes from the closets. I wandered around for a while, looking at everything and imagining the changes we were going to make, and the memories we were going to create there. The house still had all kinds of old-fashioned fixtures and features, and because of its size, it also had an old new-tone intercom system built into the walls, probably dating from the 60s or 70s. There was a large master speaker in the downstairs hallway, with a volume knob and switches marked talk and listen. Smaller intercom panels were scattered throughout the house. I had already played around with it during a couple of walkthroughs, and nothing happened. The real estate agent told us it didn't work, and the home inspector had documented the same thing. So as far as I knew, the system was dead. But standing there alone that first day, I decided to mess with it again. I turned the volume knob and flipped the intercom over to listen, and a woman's voice came through the speaker. An older woman. She simply said,
"Hello?"
This wasn't static that vaguely sounded like somebody talking. It wasn't a burst of interference that I interpreted as a voice. It was a woman, clear as day, and I understood exactly what she said.
"Hello?"
And then nothing. Obviously, I was freaked out. I yelled back, "Hello?" But I heard nothing. I walked through the entire house looking for someone who wasn't there. I went outside and circled the house. I thought maybe someone had been standing on the front porch while I was in the hallway checking out the system, but there was no one there. Then I went back to the intercom, and for the next 20 minutes I tried to make it happen again, but there was nothing. The system didn't even seem to have power. Later, when my kids came over to help, I had them go to different rooms and push buttons while I stood there at the master unit. We tried talking back and forth through it, but nothing. The system was dead. I didn't tell my family about what I'd heard, but from that point on, the house felt a little different to me. We already knew something else about its history. The matriarch of the family, who had lived there before us, had spent 40 or 50 years in the house, and near the end of her life she had been cared for in a downstairs room. It wasn't really a bedroom, but it had been converted into one so she could remain downstairs during what was essentially hospice care. And she died in that room. And during those first few days working there alone, that room bothered me. It still had its old wallpaper, drapes, and dirty carpet, and it had an outline on the carpet where the bed had sat, and that really creeped me out. At night, I avoided going inside whenever I could. Sometimes I'd actually close the doors just so I wouldn't have to look into the room when I walked past it. Eventually, we got enough of the remodeling finished so that it was time to move in. It was a long couple of days, but finally, sometime after midnight on our first night there, we were all downstairs taking a break. We decided to call it a night and headed toward the foyer and the staircase. And that was when my son pointed up. The chandelier above us was swinging, and not slightly. It was moving significantly back and forth. We stood there trying to figure out what could have caused it, but we'd all been together in the back of the house for close to an hour, and nobody had touched it. I even took some video with my phone. It was creepy. So naturally, I was feeling a little uneasy about spending our first night there. And fortunately, as far as we knew, nobody had died upstairs. And the night itself was uneventful. But the next morning, there was something lying on the living room carpet. A small, old-fashioned key. None of us recognized it. It hadn't been there the night before, and we never figured out what it belonged to or where it came from. And 5 years later, we still have it. It hangs on our key rack. Several times during those first few weeks, my wife had a strange experience of her own. She asked me one morning if I'd ever noticed a flash of light in our bedroom at night. I had no idea what she was talking about. She told me it happened twice. She had been awake in the middle of the night, either using the bathroom or checking on the kids, when the entire master bedroom suddenly lit up. Not like someone had switched on a lamp. She described it more like a flash of lightning that had illuminated the whole room, except it lasted less than a second. There was no storm outside, no obvious source for the light. The room didn't even have modern overhead lighting. The wall switches controlled outlets with lamps plugged into them, and she was certain there wasn't a lamp flickering or turning on. The whole room had flashed bright. I told her I'd never seen it. Then, a few weeks later, I was awake in the middle of the night getting a drink of water when it happened to me. Just like she said, for a split second, the bedroom lit up brightly, then it was dark again. It happened so quickly that I barely had time to process what I'd seen. But now I understood exactly what my wife had been describing. I only saw it that one time. She never saw it again after those first two incidents, and we never figured out what caused it. The house had another old feature in the downstairs hallway, a vintage tubular doorbell. 4 or 5 long brass tubes of different lengths that hung vertically on the wall. When it originally worked, little strikers would have hit the tubes and produced an old-fashioned musical door chime, instead of the ordinary electronic ding-dong most of us have today. But ours didn't work. In fact, when I replaced the original front door button with a Ring doorbell, I discovered that the old doorbell button wasn't even connected. I had never heard those brass chimes make a sound, but apparently my son had. One night he came and found me because he said the old doorbell had just rung. Not the Ring doorbell, the old chimes in the hallway. I hadn't heard it myself. I had been in the garage, but I checked outside anyway, and there was no one there. And as far as I knew, there wasn't even a functioning doorbell button capable of making those chimes ring. Another night, fairly early on, I woke up because our dog was barking downstairs. She normally wasn't a nighttime barker, so I got up to see what was wrong. As I walked down the upstairs hallway, I heard something else. Laughter. It sounded like a woman or maybe a child. And it wasn't just some vague sound that reminded me of laughter. It was around 3 a.m. My kids were asleep. I checked the entire house and found nothing. I walked outside and looked around the property, and everything was completely quiet. There was one last strange thing that happened before all of this seemed to settle down. My wife's mother had moved into the downstairs room where the previous owner had died. We never told her that someone had passed away in that room, and she never reported anything unusual happening there. Except for one thing. One day, fairly early on after she had moved in, she casually asked, "Do you guys hear that old-fashioned telephone ringing at night?" At first, I didn't know what she was talking about. And then the memory came back. I had heard it. It was one of those strange memories that apparently hadn't registered strongly enough for me to think about the next morning. But the moment she mentioned it, I knew exactly what she meant. Every once in a while, in the middle of the night, I would surface just enough from sleep to hear a telephone ringing somewhere in the house. Not a modern electronic ringtone, but an old-fashioned mechanical telephone. Over and over. Sometimes it seemed to ring 15 or 20 times. Then it would stop. My wife remembered hearing it too. The strange thing was, there was no old telephone in the house that could have been ringing. And somehow, by morning, none of us would really think about it again. It wasn't until my mother-in-law said something that we realized that more than one of us had been hearing the same thing. And after that, we finally talked about it. And we would never hear the telephone again. There's something I find especially interesting about Larry's story. Of all the strange things that happened during those first few weeks and months in the house, several of them seemed connected to old technology that had been left behind. A dead intercom suddenly produced the voice of an old woman asking hello. An old-fashioned doorbell apparently rang for his son. And in the middle of the night, 3 people independently remembered hearing an old telephone ringing somewhere in a house where no such telephone existed. Maybe those things have perfectly ordinary explanations. Old houses are full of old wiring, settling wood, and strange acoustics and equipment that doesn't always behave the way we expect. But there's another possibility. Maybe whatever remained in that house was simply making itself known through things that had once been familiar. The intercom, the door chime, the telephone. And then, after Larry and his family had been there for a while, something changed. The voices stopped, the ringing stopped, the house settled down. Maybe whatever had been there finally understood that this was someone else's home now. Maybe it was comfortable with the new family. Or maybe nobody was trying to haunt the house at all. Maybe someone was just trying to get through. Thank you to Larry for allowing me to share that story. Larry also shared some photos of the intercom system, the creepy room, and even the video of the swinging chandelier. Take a look in the ghostcollector.com show notes. Now, time for something completely different. I want to cover a pretty wide range of strange experiences here on The Ghost Collector. And one subject you don't often hear about is ghost cars. I've actually collected a few stories involving them, and here's the first. The person who shared this with me asked to remain completely anonymous, so I'm going to call him Colin. Colin writes, "My wife and I were driving along a long, flat country road, heading toward the mountains. I know this road very well. I've driven it hundreds of times. For roughly 10 miles, there are no places to turn off. No side streets, no driveways. It's mostly open land, cattle fencing, and a straight stretch of road leading toward the highway that climbs into the mountains. And on this particular day, the road was almost completely empty. I'm a pretty defensive driver, especially on that road. People sometimes make stupid passes out there, even across double yellow lines. So I check my mirrors constantly. And there had been nobody behind us for miles. At certain points, you can see a long way back down the road, maybe close to a mile or more, and there was nothing. Then I checked the rearview mirror again, and suddenly, there was a black SUV right on my bumper. It was so close that my first thought was, where the hell did that come from? Even if it had been traveling 100 miles an hour, I would have seen it approaching in the rearview. I said something to my wife immediately. The SUV started swerving back and forth behind us, moving toward the center line, then toward the shoulder, almost like the driver was desperately trying to get around me, but it never passed. There wasn't even any traffic coming from the other direction. If the driver had really wanted to pass illegally, there was nothing stopping them. I couldn't see who was behind the wheel. The windshield looked dark or heavily tinted. The whole thing immediately reminded me of that unsettling scene in Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, where another car suddenly appears behind Laura Palmer and her father and begins aggressively tailing them. That was exactly how this felt, so I sped up. Normally I wouldn't do that, but something about this car made me want some distance between us. But it didn't help. The SUV stayed right there. It followed us like that for several miles. Finally, when we were getting close to the end of the road, where it meets the highway heading into the mountains, I looked in the rearview mirror again, and the SUV was gone. Not farther back, not pulled over, just gone. And that's what bothered me. There was nowhere for it to go. No intersection, no driveway, no turnout, just fencing and open land on both sides of the road. Nowhere even to pull over on the shoulder. I hadn't seen it turn around, I hadn't seen it slow down, and it definitely hadn't passed us. I'd been checking my mirrors every 5 seconds. The car was in my side mirror peripheral vision the entire time. One moment it was practically attached to our bumper. The next, there was nothing behind us but empty road. I looked at my wife and finally said what both of us were thinking. Did we just see a ghost car? I still drive that road almost every week. I've never seen that black SUV again. There have been plenty of fatal accidents along that stretch over the years, although I have no idea whether that has anything to do with what we saw. It's just one of those experiences I've never been able to explain. Thank you to Colin for sharing that one with me. I've never personally experienced anything I would call a ghost car, but now I have 2 other stories involving mysterious vehicles that I'll be sharing in future episodes of The Ghost Collector. So if you have a ghost car story of your own, I'd definitely like to hear it. And for tonight's final story, I want to go back more than a century. Every once in a while, I like to revisit one of the classic ghost stories, the older cases that helped shape the folklore we still talk about today. And this one has something unusual going for it. It may have left behind a photograph. In 1925, aboard an oil tanker called the SS Watertown, 2 crewmen died under tragic circumstances. What allegedly happened afterward became one of the strangest maritime ghost stories of the 20th century. This is The Faces That Followed the Watertown. There are ghost stories that begin in old houses, abandoned hospitals, or lonely cemeteries. This one begins hundreds of miles from land, out on the Pacific Ocean. In the winter of 1925, the oil tanker Watertown was making its way across the Pacific toward the Panama Canal when 2 members of her crew went below deck to work inside the ship's forward cargo compartment. Their names were Michael Meehan and James Courtney. Something was wrong inside that tank. Gas. Invisible, odorless, or at least unnoticed until it was too late. Meehan and Courtney were overcome by the fumes. When the men failed to answer, the ship's chief mate, Costi Taviola, went after them. According to a contemporary newspaper account, reaching the compartment meant crawling in through a narrow tube some 40 feet long and only about 20 inches across. And Taviola went in. And then he went in again, and again. 3 times he entered the gas-filled space, trying desperately to save the 2 men. He managed to drag them out one at a time, and the effort nearly killed him. Taviola himself collapsed unconscious and he had to be revived. But for Meehan and Courtney, it was already too late. The 2 sailors were dead. There was no funeral home waiting for them, no cemetery, no family gathered around a grave. The Watertown was at sea. And so, following maritime tradition, the bodies of James Courtney and Michael Meehan were committed to the Pacific, reportedly off the coast of Mexico near Manzanillo, and the ship continued on without them. Or at least, it was supposed to. Because according to the story that grew from the Watertown voyage, only a few days after the burial, members of the crew began noticing something strange in the water beside the ship. At first, perhaps it was easy to dismiss. The ocean can play tricks on the eyes. Foam twists into shapes. Waves rise and disappear. Shadows move across the water. But the sailors kept seeing the same thing. Faces. 2 of them. Pale shapes apparently staring upward from the churning Pacific. And the crew believed they knew exactly whose faces they were seeing. Meehan and Courtney. The story was later retold by C.B. Colby in his 1959 book, Strangely Enough. Colby wrote that the apparitions appeared repeatedly at twilight, seemingly following the ship for several moments before vanishing beneath the water. Eventually, the report supposedly came from not only ordinary crewmen, but from some of the Watertown officers as well. Imagine standing along the rail of that tanker at dusk, the sun nearly gone, nothing around you but the steady vibration of the engines of miles and miles of darkening ocean. And then someone beside you points toward the wake, and there, among the white foam, are faces of two men you watched being buried at sea. Not swimming, not struggling, just looking up at you. The legend says the sightings continued often enough that the ship's captain, later accounts identify him as Keith Tracy, decided that if the faces appeared again, someone needed to photograph them. And eventually, they did. In the version recorded in the classic paranormal book, Strangely Enough, the captain was supplied with fresh film and instructed to keep it sealed until needed. When the Watertown returned through the Panama Canal, and the strange faces allegedly appeared again, the captain loaded the camera himself. He took 6 photographs. Then the film was secured until the film could be developed. 5 photographs show exactly what you would expect: water, foam, spray. But the 6th was different. In the churning sea were 2 pale, roughly human shapes. 2 heads, 2 faces. And the photograph survived. And over the following decades, it became one of the more famous images in the old literature of ghosts and psychic phenomena. To modern eyes, of course, it's far from convincing. It's blurry, it's grainy, and extraordinarily subjective. Once someone tells you there are 2 faces in the photograph, they're not difficult to see. And that may be all they are. Sea foam, shadows, random patterns interpreted by a frightened crew who had just witnessed the horrifying deaths of 2 friends. Pareidolia, captured on film. There are also inconsistencies in the versions of the story that appeared over the years. Who took the photographs, exactly when they were taken, and how the film was handled all changed depending on the telling. So whatever the Watertown photograph proves, it certainly doesn't prove that 2 dead sailors followed their ship across the Pacific. But that's not really what makes this old story unsettling, because underneath a century of embellishment, there were 2 real men, James Courtney and Michael Meehan. They really did climb into a compartment aboard the Watertown. They were overcome by gas, and their shipmates really did try to save them. And somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, their bodies were lowered over the side of the ship and disappeared beneath the waves. What happened afterwards belongs to legend. But for years, sailors told the story that the ocean gave them back. And whether those faces really belonged to James Courtney or Michael Meehan, or were only tricks of light and water, the photograph has kept their story alive for more than a century. And that's all I have for tonight. Thanks for listening to The Ghost Collector. And remember, if you have a strange story of your own, let me collect it. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow, subscribe, and share it with others who appreciate stories of the paranormal. For photos, original newspaper clippings, and additional details from tonight's story, visit theghostcollector.com. Music and sound effects used in this episode were sourced from freesound.org and are licensed under Creative Commons Attribution. Full source details are available at theghostcollector.com. Thanks for listening.